So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at how the muscle responds when, looking at what the response is like in an entire muscle to being stimulated to contract. So we'll start by talking about how neurons innervate, bring the signal into the muscle and how contraction occurs. So muscles can be subdivided into what are called motor units. A motor unit is a single neuron. So here we have a single neuron axon. So it's a single neuron in all of the muscle cells or fibers that it is responsible for stimulating and causing to contract. And it turns out that motor neurons may branch repeatedly along their length of their axon, and so they can reach out and stimulate multiple muscle fibers at one time. So this neuron here that's associated with motor unit 1 is synapsing with all of the purple colored muscle fibers here in this image. So we can see that it comes here and there's a neuromuscular junction right there. This terminates here on this cell. This branch terminates over here on this cell, and we're not able to see it, but there are other branches that are connecting it to this one, this one, this one, and this one. So in this case, motor unit 1 is actually composed of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different muscle cells that it's responsible for innervating. So when this motor neuron sends an impulse down the axon and that action potential arrives here, will also arrive here and at these other neurons as well. So when that action potential arrives, all of those muscle fibers will be stimulated to contract. And so we see a response at every muscle fiber that's a part of the motor unit that's been fired. And so within our muscles, there are multiple motor units. Okay, so the second thing to know is that there is a threshold stimulus that's required to cause muscle fiber contraction. And so if the muscle fiber does not reach, it can't contract until this threshold stimulus has been reached. But once it reaches threshold stimulus, then, and this is initiated at the neuromuscular junction. So here we have an axon coming down, and it makes a connection here at the neuromuscular junction, where we have a synapse between the axon and the axon terminal and the motor end plate. So if the muscle reaches threshold, that is, if we get enough of a signal here, then an action potential will spread along the sarcolemma and down any T-tubules to bring that action potential deep into the cell, where it will cause the myofibrils to then contract. So a muscle contraction occurs as an all or none response. That is, we either stimulate the muscle fiber to reach threshold and cause a contraction, or there's no contraction at all. So it's a minimum strength of contraction that will occur. And it's either a question of bringing the muscle fiber to threshold so that it will cause a contraction, or if you don't bring it to threshold, if it comes almost to this threshold stimulus required, but it doesn't make threshold, then there is no contraction. And remember, because a whole muscle is composed of many muscle fibers and many motor units within that muscle, then some of the motor units will contract while others are relaxed. So we don't necessarily contract every single muscle fiber or every single motor unit in a muscle at the same time. So we usually are seeing partial contractions, where some of the motor units are stimulated to contract and others are not. So if we look at a single contraction cycle, we can use a machine that's called a myogram, and it produces a readout that looks like this. This is a myograph, where we can look at, here on the y-axis, we can look at how much contraction force is being stimulated in the muscle, or in the muscle fiber actually. And this is time on the x-axis here. So time is passing, and we see this on the x-axis. And so if we were to follow the sequence of activities that occurs when we bring a muscle fiber to threshold and cause a single contraction cycle, we will see that there are several different, very distinct activities that occur. And we talk about this single bringing the muscle fiber to threshold and then allowing a single action potential to spread across the sarcolemma. The resulting contraction is referred to as a twitch. So a single twitch, or a twitch, is a single contraction cycle of a muscle. So let's take a look at the different phases of the contraction cycle of a single twitch. So when the stimulus is applied, so here at this time, stimulus is applied, that means we bring the motor end plate to threshold. There's a period of time called the latent period. If something is latent, it's waiting. It's there, it's ready, but it's not involved in any activity yet. There's a very brief, about 2 millisecond period of time that's called the latent period, when there is no change in the tension in the muscle fiber. So notice that the line is flat through the latent period. So it begins here at stimulus, and the latent period ends as we see some tension beginning to build in the muscle fiber. And this is the time when that nerve impulse is traveling along the sarcolemma, so along the surface of the muscle fiber, and then heading down the T-tubules, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum is just releasing the calcium ions. So that is the latent period. No contraction has started yet because we haven't had enough time for the calcium to diffuse over to the troponin to cause the binding sites on actin to be exposed. So the latent period, no change in muscle tension. It's very brief, lasts about 2 milliseconds. A millisecond is a thousandth of a second. So if we could divide a second into 1,000 pieces of units of time, then that would be 1 millisecond. So it's 2,000ths of a second. Okay, following the latent period, we see the period of contraction. So the contraction period begins as the sarcomeres in each myofibril in the muscle fiber begin shortening until the muscle, so right here, so there's the beginning, that's where they begin shortening, and they start to develop force, they start to develop force, contracting force in the muscle. And this contraction period ends when the muscle reaches the peak tension that is going to be found in that twitch. So this period of time here lasts about 15 milliseconds, and during this time the calcium ions are flooding into the sarcoplasm, and they're binding to troponin, and the troponin is changing shape, pulling tropomyosin away from, or tucking it away from, the actin binding sites. And this exposes those actin binding sites and allows the cross bridges to reach up, bind at the binding sites, and then do the power stroke, flex, which causes sarcomeres to shorten. And as the calcium ions then are being reabsorbed by the sarcoplasmic reticulum and being cleared from the sarcoplasm, then the contraction period ends once enough calcium has been removed so that the troponin falls back, or troponin allows tropomyosin to fall back and cover the binding sites on the actin molecules. So that's the contraction period. And over the course of the contraction period, the muscle reaches the peak tension that we are going to see associated with that twitch. Finally, there's the relaxation period. Relaxation is the time from the peak contraction force until the muscle returns to the resting contracted state, when no more tension exists in the muscle fiber. So this is the longest period. It lasts about 25 milliseconds. And during this time, the sarcomere tension decreases from peak tension, decreases until it reaches the minimum tension, until there's no more tension left. And the relaxation period occurs because enough of the calcium ions have been removed from the sarcoplasm so that troponin can no longer pull tropomyosin away from the binding sites. So now the binding sites are blocked again. By the very end, the binding sites are completely blocked and no more cross-bridge attachments can be formed. So that is a single twitch, beginning with, at the point of stimulation, a very brief latent period, 2 milliseconds, then a period of contraction during which peak tension is generated, and then a long period of relaxation as the muscle cell returns to the resting state with very little tension, and finally no tension in the muscle fiber. So, muscle contractions, though, in the body can produce a variety of strength of contractions and a variety of force that they can create or can make as the muscle contracts. So the amount of force that is produced by a muscle is the result of two things. One of those things is called summation of muscle twitches, where we send a very rapid series of action potentials down the neuron to the neuromuscular junction so that before the cell has a chance to fully relax, it gets another round of contractions. A second twitch arrives and it contracts a little further. And then before it fully relaxes, it contracts again. So that's referred to as summation of twitches, and we're going to look at that in the next slide. And then we can also create strong, the second way that we create strong muscular contractions. First one is summation. So we get multiple twitches that occur before the previous twitch can fully relax. So the second way that we get really strong contractions in a muscle is a whole, and we're talking now about a whole muscle, not a single muscle fiber. The second way that we can get strong contractions in that muscle is to recruit more muscle fibers in to making the contraction happen. So we can increase the number of motor units that are going to take part in the contraction. And the more motor units that are involved in the contraction, then the greater the force we'll see generated in the muscle, the greater the tension that we create in the muscle. Okay, so let's take a look at summation of muscle twitches. So if a muscle contracts in response to a stimulus and then receives, so we get here, well, first, if we completely allow the muscle to relax between sending it a stimulus to contract, what we get is a series of twitches. But if we hit the muscle, and now we're looking at, there we are. We're looking at this B graph here. This is the graph I want you to notice now. If we hit it with a signal to contract, there'll be a very brief latent period, and then the muscle will reach peak tension. And as it begins to relax, but before it's fully relaxed, if we hit it with another signal to contract, then rather than relaxing, the muscle will go straight back into a contraction phase. And this time, because it's starting from a little bit more contracted state, it will reach an even higher peak tension. And then as it starts to relax again, boom, we nail it with another signal to contract, and eventually we can get a maximal contraction. So in this case, we're just hitting it with 3 twitches. By the time the 3rd twitch is done, we have all the tension that we needed to create in the muscle generated, and we let the muscle relax. And it returns back to the resting length, and there's no more signal to contract. So this occurs, summation occurs, because when, as the muscle fiber is beginning to relax, we're starting to clear enough calcium from the sarcoplasm that the actin binding sites begin to get covered up again. But if right at that moment we hit it with another signal to contract, then we'll get a new dump of calcium ions into the sarcoplasm before the first dump of calcium ions is fully cleared. So we kind of short circuit the relaxation phase by forcing it to contract a little further. And so if this is a sarcomere, say, and the first muscle contraction caused the sarcomere to shorten this much, then it would start to, so there's the first twitch. It starts to relax, it gets a little longer again, so it relaxes to out here. So now we hit it with another stimulus to contract, and since it's already partially contracted, as that twitch occurs, then now the sarcomere shortens to this length. And then if we hit it with another twitch before it can fully relax, it'll shorten up to this length, and so on, until eventually all the sarcomeres can become shortened as much as they're going to be shortened. So that is the summation of muscle twitches, where we add one twitch on top of another, until we reach whatever peak tension is desired in that muscle. So if those muscle contractions come so rapidly that the time spent in the relaxation phase is very brief, so that so if we sum until we reach the very maximum tension that can be maintained in the cell, and then just kind of hold it there where it's wiggling back and forth between peak tension and slightly less than peak tension. We call that partial tetany. That's partial tetany. Then if we speed up the stimulation even more quickly, we can reach a point where the muscle just remains fully contracted. And that is referred to as complete tetany, or a complete tetanic contraction. So in complete tetany, the muscle fiber comes to peak tension, and peak tension is maintained for some long period of time. So by increasing the rate, notice here how each one of those arrows represents a stimulus. So we have a long period between this stimulus and the next one. So it allows some contraction. The next one gets a little bit less. And now we're getting really short periods of time. So we're seeing very little relaxation. It's mostly contracting, adding force to adding strength or tension to the muscle. Until we reach a point where they are coming so rapidly that we never even allow even a little bit of relaxation to occur. The calcium levels in the sarcoplasm stay sufficiently high enough that it just remains fully contracted. Okay, that's tetany, complete tetany. Okay, so that's one way to get powerful muscle contractions, is that we bring one, or the beginning idea is that we bring muscle fibers to tetany in order to get a good, strong contraction. So the second component of getting good, strong contractions comes as we recruit additional motor fibers or motor units into the contraction. So the size of the motor unit is what determines how fine motor control we have over a movement. If there are just a few muscle fibers involved in the motor units, so that there's a bunch of motor units in the muscle, the whole muscle, and each neuron controls just a few of the actual the actual muscle fibers, then we can get very fine motor control. We can get just minute little movements or changes in the contracting state of the muscle. And one place where we see these very small motor units is in the eye muscles that are just pulling the eye around just a little bit so that we can focus exactly where we want to be looking. And so there may only be 4 to 6 muscle fibers in a single motor unit in these eye muscles. While a large muscle that we don't have a lot of fine control over, one example would be the muscles of the quadriceps group on the anterior surface of the thigh. There, an individual motor unit may have anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 muscle fibers involved in it. And so when we tell 2,000 muscle fibers to contract, we're going to get a lot of movement happening. So we don't get just a little bit of movement, we get lots of movement when we tell even just one motor unit that it's time to contract. So again, remember that while the response of a single motor unit is always all or none, how much contraction we see in a full muscle, it really depends on how many motor units are activated. And as the intensity of stimulation increases, as the rapidity with which we provide action potentials calling the muscle to contract, then more and more motor units get involved. So that's what. So when we bring a bunch of motor units to tetany, that's when we get the most powerful contractions. So the usual manner in which muscles contract is for the individual motor units and the muscle fibers that those neurons control is to come all the way to tetany for a brief period of time. Now, you cannot hold a tetanic contraction for forever because we'll run out of ATP very quickly so there's not going to be sufficient ATP in a muscle cell to let it stay at tetany for a very long period of time. So what we see happening is that in order to get nice, smooth muscle movements is that we are constantly cycling motor units on and off. While they're on, they're causing contractions in that muscle that we're looking at. And when they're off, they are restoring the homeostasis in the cell. So as one or a group of motor units that are working at tetany, as they become fatigued, like we talked about in the last lecture, where they run out of ATP, well then they relax and other motor units are recruited in to sustain that contraction. So the strongest of muscle contractions occur when we bring many motor units to tetany all at the same time. And that allows the whole muscle to contract and allows the movement or creates the movement of any of the bones that are attached to that muscle or those that are attached to that muscle. Okay, last little bit for this lecture is to discuss the idea of muscle tone. Now here we're not talking about someone who has a lot of muscles that are nice and sleek. That's not what we mean by muscle tone. What we mean by muscle tone is that muscles are always kept, or generally kept, in a state of partial contraction. And we maintain this state of partial contraction, which we call muscle tone, by activating just a few of the motor units in the muscle. And so when those motor units tire, then they relax, and other motor units take over that partial contraction in the muscle. So these kinds of tonic contractions, they don't produce movement because they cannot, because it's just a few muscle motor units that are involved. They can't generate sufficient contraction tension to actually cause bones to move. But instead, they maintain the muscle in this firm, partly contracted state so that the muscle is always at a ready, always standing ready to receive a signal that it's time to contract, and it can respond relatively quickly because the entire muscle is already in a partially contracted state. And last of all, this kind of tone, muscle tone, helps to maintain posture and stabilizes joints so that we can be at rest and ready and ready to leap into action. So when people lose consciousness, when somebody passes out, and I've got two pictures here from some classic movies of women they've just passed out. So when that happens, when a person loses consciousness that way, one of the effects of that is that we lose all of this muscle tone. So all those muscle fibers that were maintaining muscle tone in the body and keeping the muscle in a nice, firm, partially contracted state, all of them will stop sending signals, and in response, the whole body will collapse. So when losing muscle tone means that we no longer have the ability to support our bodies in an upright way. And so the woman swoons in Frankenstein's monster's arms, or the woman falls into a faint at the mere thought of something shocking and horrific. So, sorry, women. Of course, we're looking at it. Please, don't be offended. Know that I recognize that we are looking at stereotypes here, but those are the best images I can find of somebody passing out because they've lost all muscle tone. All right, so there you've seen it. A lot of the muscular responses that we can expect to see in muscles when they are stimulated and the muscle cell is brought to threshold. Any questions? Send me an email. So don't forget, we've got the exam on Monday night. See you then.